Hello and welcome to Dancer Support Mission by Sabine for Shine Your Light. Today we have a new episode of Dancer to Dancer, Words of Wisdom. And the goal of those interviews is to meet the person behind the dancer and share with you all not only the highlights of someone's career, but also the challenges behind the scenes. Truly, my wish is to bring healing into the dance world. Dancing to heal, healing to dance, one artist at a time and one personal story at a time. So today I'm really delighted to have Richard Chen See with me. Thank you, Richard, for taking the time to be available, on this Easter weekend.
Absolutely.
and talk to us all about your experience and your career. So we're going to start by, I know you're an expert in Paul Taylor. You're one of the regisseurs. You restage his ballets all over the world. So you're going to talk to us a little bit about that. But I would like to start with the beginning. How did you decide that you were going to have, this profession, and how did you start dancing? Why?
Hello, Sabine. Thank you so much for interviewing me. I will just, say I feel very honored, but also a little sort of sheepish about talking about myself in this way, because I think that I think what you're looking for is, to understand that we are not always the étoile that shows the best of what we do as a profession, but that also we are regular everyday people who are, finding dance as a profession.
Yeah.
So I actually grew up in Jamaica, a small island in the West Indies, when it had just transitioned from being a British colony. And we were what was considered, and still probably is today, a third world country. So we were, not quite into full development. And I never imagined dance as a profession. But when I was very young, I was always fascinated by performing arts, music, theater. And I did a course at school when I was about 7 years old called musical movement, which was essentially calisthenics set to music. So it was physical education class set to music. And my teacher used to take ballet from a ballet teacher, and they were looking for boys to come and take classes at the school. And so she invited her teacher to come and see me. And three boys from the school were invited to come and start taking ballet classes. And two of us started. I was the only one that kind of stuck with it. And I was 7 years old. So, it was fun. It was interesting. And I got very involved with the concept of ballet as opposed to other forms of dance. So I started to read about it, and I got a lot of just picture books that, had photographs of, again, what I would consider for me incredibly exotic images and ideas. But I never thought of it as a profession. I never thought of it as something to aspire to. And I loved ballet because it was codified. It was very clear. It was very clean what it is that you needed to achieve, to point your foot, to brush the floor, to fondu. It was sequential. And I grew up in a very communicative, tropical environment. So we're very emphatic and just passionate about life and communication and language. So to have a language that was clear, almost like Latin. I went to Roman Catholic high school. I was taught by Jesuit priests, and I loved Latin as a language because there were so few exceptions. And I think I parallel that. I think I do parallel that with my love for ballet, where it was like, oh, I know exactly what it is I'm supposed to do. Whether I can do it or not, that's a different matter, but I know what I'm supposed to do. So that was really how I got involved with it.
So it's the
And
structure of ballet that attracted you in a way.
yes, it was. It was structure, it was form, it was discipline. And again, there was this interesting thing. I was a very active child and I wanted to do gymnastics. But where I was growing up, boys, there were no classes, there were no training gyms to teach gymnastics to boys, and that's just, you know, I didn't have access to that. But ballet became sort of a way to be physical and to find ways to discipline my body. And my ballet teachers actually encouraged us to take other forms of dance. And so I started learning all of the national dance forms in Jamaica. So,
Oh,
you know,
nice.
the roots of Afro West Indian dance, Kumina, Pocomania, you know, even some of the Haitian national dances. So it had a very, very different approach to it. It was a very much dance as a community event, dance as paying homage to the gods, you know, to honor them, to invite them to bestow good fortune on you, whatever it was. So that was very different than ballet. Ballet for me was a very clinical form of study, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that contrast. To be able to do both, to have
You were
teachers
lucky
that
to have both because I
I was,
imagine that
and
really helped you in the after that, right?
it did. It served me very well moving forward in ways that I could never have anticipated.
So,
So, so when I was 13, um, we used to, in Jamaica, take RAD, Royal Academy of Dancing syllabi, and have examiners come from England. And so an examiner from England came and recommended me to the Royal Ballet School. And I had no clue what that meant. I did not sort of understand, like, what is this? But I did know the name, and I did start doing some more research. And I went to my parents and I said, you know, I've been offered this great opportunity that I can audition for the Royal Ballet School. You know, my teachers think that it's a great opportunity. You know, would you let me go? And I think that, you know, here we get into something that a lot of boys in the West encounter, which is my family were not
convinced.
thrilled with this idea. Um, so I kind of struck a bargain with my father, and I said, okay. My father gave me an envelope, and he says, you need to put in this envelope your high school diploma. So in Jamaica, we followed a British school system, and we had to do our ordinary levels and then our advanced levels. So I did my ordinary level exams, my O level exams. And in the US, people have only become familiar with that system through the Harry Potter series
Oh yeah.
because it follows sort of the high school aspects of it. But I did my O levels when I was 15, and I handed my father my high school diploma, and he gave me a ticket and some money, and that was the last time I spoke to my parents for about 3 years. I had to get the visa on my own. I went to England, and I still didn't know what that was. I didn't know what it meant to become a professional dancer. I just knew that there was an opportunity, there was a name, I grew up on a small island. It was a way to get off the island. And I also grew up with a lot of traditional stories about children going off into the world to seek their fortune. So I figured, hey, there's my opportunity. I get to go out into the world and seek my fortune. But I seriously had no idea what that meant, what it would entail, how both rewarding and lonely and difficult and exciting and all of those contradictions that we encounter as we go through life.
But how was it actually to land in England, all alone?
So my most vivid memory about landing in England was I went to England in 1977, and it was during a sort of period of unrest where there were very young, like teenage children coming from the Philippines who were sort of creating havoc with aspects of terrorism in London. So when I landed, because I'm of Chinese descent, they stopped me. And because I was a minor still, I was not yet 17, I was 15, it was before my 16th birthday. They stopped me at the airport and they kept me for 2 hours and interrogated me. And I finally said, I'm not sure what's going on here, but you keep talking to me as though I come from the Philippines. I come from Jamaica. I come from a small West Indian Commonwealth island. That's what my passport says. And they said, well, we're not sure. We need to verify your passport. And I said, well, I'm one of the few Commonwealth countries that requires a visa to come to England. So you can look at my visa, and eventually they let me go. And so I think that I spent the next few weeks being incredibly bewildered at where I was. It was a completely different environment than I grew up with. It was cold,
Wet.
wet. And actually, when I went to England at first, I ended up going to the north of England. I didn't stay in London. I had to go and finish my my advanced exams in ballet. So I ended up going to Whitley Bay, which is very near to Newcastle on Tyne, up by the Scottish border. And so not only that, some of the dancers in the school took me to the North Sea to go wading. I had never been in water that cold. Even though it was my ankles, I thought they were going to fall off. I thought my feet were going to fall off. It was so cold. So it was complete culture shock for me. And I think how I dealt with it was to just focus on my dancing, to focus on training and my classes and the new vocabulary that I had to learn. And it was easy to be in class and just focus on what you were doing right there. I think it was difficult when I was outside of class because I was used to being a West Indian kid that would yell and scream when I was angry and, cross the street anytime I wanted. And there were all these other social rules that, because I had left my family, I didn't have any guidance in that respect. So I admit I probably got into a lot more trouble than was necessary at that point in time, just socially. In terms of adapting to a different culture. And I guess my sanctum was to be in a studio just working hard. I didn't think of it as working hard. I just thought of it as I know what I have to focus on. And that took care of that period of time.
So by that time, being in the Royal Ballet, your goal was to be a ballet dancer.
Well, again, I was not yet in the Royal Ballet. I had gotten to that point where it was like I had to complete my major exams in RAD before I could even
Oh,
audition.
it's yeah, okay, sorry, I
And
misunderstood.
so it was again, I was learning what ballet was, but I was also learning that I didn't look like everybody else. That didn't concern me in terms of like how we think of it today, in terms of what you look like. What concerned me was the fact that, I remember learning these rules. It's like, in order to do arabesque allongé, your foot and your hands needed to be at the same height. In order to do, arabesque penché, your foot needed to be higher than the line of your head and your hands. And like all of a sudden it became this geometry about what could I get my body to do
Mhm.
so that my line would match. And because I was shorter, for instance, my arabesque line, my foot had to be a little bit higher because all of the guys in class, where again, I'd never been in a class with more than one other guy. So all the guys in class were taller than me. So my foot couldn't be here for arabesque. My foot had to be up here to match the line. So that when you look down the line, the core of dancers, that's where it would be. So, you know, I started to see it um, very much in the way that I think of learning to pass an exam, as opposed to thinking about a future or an aesthetic or that type of idea. Ballet was never taught to me in that way until I was sort of in the conservatory, and one of my teachers and coaches was Christopher Gable,
Mhm.
who had been a principal at the Royal Ballet, and it was just he took a liking to me and took me under his wing, and I was incredibly appreciative of him talking to me about. So what he said to me, he goes, if I had been born 20 years earlier, I would have just taken off because I worked so hard, because I was so dedicated. I was very good at creating characters, and we used to talk about the idea that movement was a way to express um, character, emotion, environment, tone, all of that. And he was the first person that taught me about the craft of performing, and I became more and more fascinated with characters in dance, with how not just movement could be geometric and abstract, but how it actually could create an atmosphere,
Mhm.
you know, not just an emotion, but how groups interacted, and the intent of the group was so much a part of movement and performing, and the reason why we wanted to have the discipline to adjust, make small details different. um, and that started to drive me in terms of knowing what kind of dancing I wanted to do. um, and I was still very much in line right up until I signed my first contract as an apprentice with Northern Ballet Theatre in Manchester, in England at the time, was where it was. Um, I was still very much in line of thinking I was going to be a ballet dancer. And I continued to work for the next 5 years in ballet companies. And I was very involved with learning about it, learning what classicism was, because I grew up without any of that. I had seen the Cuban National Ballet in Jamaica when I was a child, because that was the only ballet company that actually toured through Jamaica. So, and they're brilliant, but their training was not the kind of training that I was getting. And I understood that. The aesthetic was different. They
Mhm.
had very Russian training. And I learned those differences later by the time I came to the United States. But in England, it was very British. I was learning the works of uh, the Diaghilev Ballet Russe. So, doing uh, Scheherazade, pullets and dances, being one of the core, doing all of that. Um, and just, continuing to be able to work with my coach, with Christopher Gable, and learning about what is both exciting and fulfilling about being able to perform dance, to go beyond
Was he also part
words.
of the company, or was he outside?
He was already outside. He was already sort of independent, and he had been an actor, and he was just starting back into teaching at that point in time. He had not yet started Central Ballet School in London. So this is just prior to that. And by the time I left England, he had then started Central Ballet School, but I assisted him on his restaging of Coppelia for the Bush Davies School. So, it's like I think that was the greater part of my education to being a young performer, than anything I learned being in a conservatory or in my training. It was very much, okay, this is what I love about theater. It's all encompassing capacity to challenge you both mentally and physically and expressively, and to be honest with your feelings about it. I was trained, you can't lie on stage because there are too many eyes watching. So you need to believe what it is that you're doing. And how do you find that? Because we don't always agree with what we have to perform, but you have to find a way to believe in it.
And believing in yourself while you do it.
Absolutely.
Makes sense inside.
Yeah. And I think that's true. I think that's very much, how do you especially when, I was like 19 years old. I was defining myself by my dancing, by my capacity to work and to perform. I was not yet a formed individual, named Richard. I was a dancer named Richard. And that would prove to be difficult, because when I got injured a couple years later and I couldn't dance for 6 months, I had never known what it was like to not be able to be physical, to go into the studio, to take class, to rehearse on my own, to rehearse with the company. I just had never known what that was like. And I think that started me on a journey of trying to figure out, like, who am I if I don't dance?
And that's such an amazing point, because most dancers, I mean, not most, I can't say that, but a lot of dancers realize that when they stop dancing, all of a sudden they're like,
Right.
who am I? So very
Yes.
often either injury or even just curiosity can really lead you to find your own treasure, right? Which is the sooner you find it, or at least start discovering it, the most fascinating it becomes, I find.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I don't wish injury on any dancer, but certainly it was one of the turning points for me, that made me look differently at myself, both as a dancer and as an individual person.
So what would you say was the most challenging thing while growing up? Like while learning to be a dancer, what was the most challenging part for you?
Well, I think, as I've just described, it was actually learning what it meant to dance professionally. It was like, because I had no idea. Literally, I didn't know. I'd never read an autobiography of a dancer. I didn't even know such a thing existed.
Yeah, but it
I
doesn't sound like a challenge to you, because you were so curious and so open, and so you know what I mean when I say,
Yeah. So if you're saying about challenges, about like the things that got in the way,
yeah, maybe.
then yes, then I would say um the biggest challenge, and again, I want to be careful that we put this in the context of the late 1970s,
Yeah.
not the lens that dancers today may look at this. But it was suggested to me that in order to get a certain job, that I have plastic surgery done on my eyes so that I had more occidental looking eyes so that they could project more. And I think people are much more familiar with like Gelsey Kirkland's book talking about her sense of plastic surgery and wanting to match that. But that became very true for myself, you know, where the responses I would get from auditioning would be things like, this was sort of, it was suggested to me because of feedback that my teachers and my coaches got, saying, you know, he's too small and sort of not our typical classical ballet body to not become a soloist. Like he'll stick out too much in the core. So we want to make sure that his face projects and that, you know, we know that he can sustain it technically and dance wise, but we're just worried about how his face projects. So suddenly I understood that, you know, this was a visual aesthetic. This art was based on more than just what I was capable of doing. And that's why I'm saying we have to put it into the context of these are the 1970s. This was very standard. This is very much like you can't get into the Royal Ballet School if you don't have the right proportions. You couldn't, you know, they were testing the size of my wrist to see how much I would grow, you know, to see whether or not I had reached.
Still do that in Paris Opera.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. So there's those aspects that you did have to learn. And what it meant to me was that I just simply had to be better. I had to be better than everybody else. And I don't see that as a bad thing. You know, it was difficult, but at the same time, I was fortunate enough to be able to achieve that because I did get work. And whenever through my life, I have wanted to get work in dance, either as a dancer and now as a teacher or, you know, a professional that knows the industry, I have been able to. So I feel like I've proved both to myself and to the industry that I deserve to be here. You know,
and also I think your upbringing was a great strength, right? You know, this community life, this, you know, you could feel that you were held. So I guess that makes you stronger also to face those kinds of situations.
Yes, absolutely. You know, and I am so appreciative of my teachers and my coaches and, you know, my mentors. Sadly, at this point, you know, I'm turning 60 and you know, most of my mentors have passed away. And so, you know, I hope, I know that I did them proud, you know, within this profession. Certainly, I exceeded anything that I could imagine. It's not that I exceeded my dreams because I didn't know what those dreams were supposed to be, but I could never have imagined the life that I had as a performer.
Okay, so tell us more about your life as a performer after your classical.
So, as a third world citizen of Jamaica, they were changing the immigration laws in England right at the end of the 70s under Margaret Thatcher. And after 3 years in England, I couldn't stay. So I started roaming the world, literally. I went to France, I went to Germany, I ended up in Mexico. I literally was looking for anywhere that I could get a job. And I wasn't even 21 at that point in time, which by the time I ended up in the United States, I had spent 2 years kind of bouncing around, taking, you know, a job for 2 months here, a job for 2 months there, 6 months there, waiting for a visa, not getting a visa. And I ended up in the United States still looking for a job as a ballet dancer. I was well trained, I was accomplished, but I was very much versed in Diaghilev era dance, and I was very much European, British trained, not Russian trained. So in the US, by the time we get to the early 80s, they're looking for, most companies are looking for Balanchinian dancers with that kind of background. They were looking for tall, slender, lanky men, and I didn't fit that bill. Directors gave me great feedback after the end of the audition. I always got to the end of the auditions, and they said, we love your commitment. You have great ballon. You've got good battery. We're just a little concerned because even though you are the same age as a lot of the dancers that they're taking, you're a far more formed performer. And I had more experience than most American boys at that age because I'd been, performing for 3 years, but I was also British trained. So I ended up getting the job at Oakland Ballet, who were doing a lot of the Diaghilev works. My very first rehearsal with them was they were learning Politsian dances from Prince Igor, being set by a Ballet Russe dancer, Freddie Franklin. And he would come back through in my life many years later after that, but he brought me and I was doing the small boys, the 4 small boys that come on in it. And it was just so much fun to have finally landed a full-time job, which was like for 9 months. And again, when I landed in the US, I had to figure out how it was different because the US are very much, even their contracts in those days were like working as a pickup company. In other words, you would be freelancing and you would get a job for 9 months, and then you'd have to figure out what to do for 3 or 4 months, and then maybe you got another job with that company. And they didn't pay very well. So I wasn't used to that concept. I'd been in England and I was like, oh, I can actually make a living on this. And then I came to the US and I got a job dancing. It's like, no, I can't make a living on this. But great repertory. I got introduced to the early Americana ballets. I got to dance in Billy the Kid when Eugene Loring was still alive. I got to do works by Ruth Anna Boris, like Cakewalk. And also Oakland Ballet at that point in time were doing Scheherazade, Les Biches, Les Noces, all the Nijinsky works. With Irina and Kira Nijinsky were still alive. So I was getting to encounter these magnificent, like, grand dames of dance, not just in the United States, but from the European traditions with which I was familiar. But one additional thing that got added into that was the staging of Green Table. And Kurt Jost died in 1979, and I didn't learn it until 1982, set by his daughter Anna Marquardt. And again, that was just a magnificent experience of getting to dig into a work that had so much thought and care behind it. And I think this goes back to my love of ballet. It's like I knew what it was supposed to be. It was codified. It was, clearly notated, all of those types of things, but yet there was a character underneath it. And I was cast to do Profiteer. And it was a challenge for me because I was so young. And I often tell the story, the day before our dress rehearsal was when I learned the final solo in Aftermath. And I was crying. I literally was in the parking lot of the studios just crying, and Anna came out and she said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "I feel like I'm just so unprepared. And, I feel like I'm the only evil thing in this dance." And it was just sort of overwhelming. And if you think about it, I was still defining myself by my dancing.
Mhm.
Like, this is who you are, and you have to play this one evil character. And she never even specifically talked to me about it. I understood that. And she said to me, "Look, first things first, calm down." Second thing, we're creating art. It's not real life. This is what art is. Art makes us look at life, look at the things that maybe are not so great to look at. But art makes it something that audiences and performers get to experience without having to put their life on the line, so to speak.
Mhm.
And then she was incredibly encouraging, because she says, one of the reasons why I did not get around to you was the fact that I saw that every time I taught you something, by the next rehearsal, you were ready to move on. And if you were going in the wrong direction, I would have told you. And we needed time for production matters and everything else. And she goes, "You've never once let me down in terms of being able to convince me of your character, of your dancing, of your knowledge of the choreography." And I took away from that um, an acceptance that I belonged in this profession. Because everything, like not being able to get a visa, not being the right size, not being, I was told at one point, and I found this so funny, I think of myself as a Jamaican, but I was told, "I'm sorry, we have two Chinese and one Japanese person in the company, and you would put our balance of nationalities over the top." And I said, "Yeah, but I'm Jamaican." Like, "Yeah, but you look Chinese Asian." And it's like, okay. And again, this went back to understanding that this was a visual art. Um, and I find it ironic that today that would be considered so, actionable. Yeah.
But I mean,
um,
I know from knowing Anna Makar that if she says that, it's pretty amazing, because she was seriously thorough when she would coach somebody. Nothing was left, to. So it was great trust that she had in you, because everything was millimetered, in what
yes.
she was
No,
doing.
and I never took it for granted. Even after I left the company, she had the company invite me back to perform it, and then left me in charge of coaching the profiteer that was in the company there. So, um, and it was, again, I was too young to really understand the weight of that type of honor, you know. But decades later, when I would stage work, I used the example of how she staged Green Table to set myself up, to be prepared, to be detailed, to not let people learn from a video, to
Mhm.
teach every single step, to
I mean,
talk about intent.
sorry.
No, that's it. And as I said, it's to say, um, but yeah, that's why I bring it up very specifically. Um, and this also addresses, how do we advance through the difficulties, through the challenges that we encounter. And if I take a more Eastern philosophical approach to it, which, interestingly enough, my coach, Christopher Gable, was so involved with reading like J. Krishnamurti and learning about Buddhism and things like that. Um, but if I take that more Eastern approach to it, I think that the challenges and obstacles that we meet are the things that help us define how we progress in our lives, in our professions, in our work, what we do. It's not always that they are a roadblock that we can't get past, but that, I used to, and I still do, I look at them as challenges that I have to meet. And if that's the expectation that I need to be able to overcome, then it's up to me to be proud of the effort I've made, whether or not I can pass that obstacle.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. So how did you get to Paul Taylor?
So I had my classical career and I was in my mid-20s and I kind of had a crisis of, okay, I'm here, I'm enjoying the work. What do I do when I'm 29 years old and I have to retire? And that's again, that's exactly,
that's early.
well, the thing is, I signed my first apprentice contract when right before my 16th birthday. And I was going, okay, so I've been doing this for 10 years. How much longer can I do this? And in those days, especially in the US, there was all of this talk about the baby ballerinas for, Balanchine. And everyone else I knew that was in the company that were principals were getting ready to retire by the time they were 30. So I thought, classical ballet, yeah, I've got to retire by the time I'm 29, or at least get started on what I wanted to do. So I quit the ballet company. I think I was about 25, and I immediately panicked. I was like, I don't have a job. What am I doing? And I took the very first job that got offered to me, which was with a modern company called ODC San Francisco, which was originally Oberlin Dance Collective, which is where they came up with the letters of ODC. And they still exist. They're now known as ODC Dance. And I will add, when I came to the US was the very first time that I'd started working with choreographers creating original work. Mm-hmm. So I had never done that before. As a ballet dancer, 99% of our repertory tends to be existing repertory. It's only in the last few decades that we've encountered more and more like, oh, it's about new work. That happened sort of in the mid 20th century, when you had these big choreographers like Macmillan and Balanchine, but you had to be dancing in those large companies. Mm-hmm. And then the AIDS crisis hit, and we lost so many of those choreographers and potential choreographers who would have been creating new work. So I had been doing all the legacy works of the Diaghilev period. So I gained an interest in the process of how choreographers were working with dancers. I never had a particular interest in choreographing my own work, but when I joined a modern company in the US, I discovered this challenge of like, what's your voice? Who are you? How do you improvise? How do you come up with a response to a poem or, speaking a dialogue while you're actually dancing? All of those types of things started to come into it. And my earlier training in Afro West Indian dance started to kick in. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, I don't move like I was trained entirely just, in a classical conservatory. And I have a natural sense of bigness in my movement from being West Indian, mm-hmm. from growing up in these very sort of open spaces and, never wearing shoes when I was growing up. Yeah. so I started to find a new definition for myself, but I was still on this track that I got to figure out what I got to do next. I had early on, when I came to the United States, worked with a choreographer named Jeffrey Holder, who had done musicals and a lot of, other stuff, and had worked with Dance Theatre of Harlem, and had his own company, and, just magnificent artist, performer, actor, choreographer. And yeah, he said to me, it's like, what's your encore? You have to have multiple encores in your life. And that was it. Like, I was trying to figure out, like, what is that encore after dancing?
That's wonderful. I like that.
Yeah.
Encore.
And I'd had a couple of injuries, which actually got me involved with getting outdoors. And I didn't grow up with sort of the freedom to go camping and that type of thing. So I learned that much later. But I found that I loved being on the water. So I took up kayaking, and I took up canoeing, and, more recently I do stand-up paddleboarding. I just love being outside, and I love doing things relative to the water. To me, that was a great partnership, because I loved partnering, and rarely did I get as much opportunity because I'm shorter and smaller, but I'm incredibly strong. And when I ended up joining Taylor, Paul himself found it fascinating to put me with the biggest man in the company, or a woman that was taller than me, and, say, how is he going to solve the problem of, yeah, partnering these people?
With contrast, basically.
Yes. So it was, it was that challenge where I started looking at modern dance. I was living in California, where Oakland Ballet was, and then ODC was in San Francisco. I lived in the Bay Area for 10 years. And at the end of it, I was thinking about retiring. I was talking to friends who were working in universities and professors and teaching. And what came back was I needed to dance. I needed to have on my resume a New York company. So in all of the United States, and again, here's one of those challenges that, you talk about what were the difficulties, and I seem to always just turn them into, well, if I can overcome that, this is the next thing we're going to do. So I was looking at New York companies, and it just happened that the Taylor company were doing an open audition, because they only audition when they need a dancer, and they don't have contracts. They just simply, like, it's like a business agreement. You shake hands, you come in, you do your best for Paul does his best for you. If you're ready to leave, you give them notice because of consideration for the other dancers and the repertory and what they're doing. And if he feels like he's not happy with you, he also is entitled to let you go. So I decided I would do the audition, and I'll be honest, I was jet lagged. I came in, I was 2 hours late. I was actually taking class somewhere else when the audition started, and a friend saw me and said, "What are you doing in New York?" And I said, "Oh, I came in to do the audition for Taylor." She goes, "Well, the men's audition was at 10 a.m. I'm looking at my watch going, "It's 10:15. And I dashed out, and I went, and I'd misread it, and I just squeaked in. They did not want me coming in. I just squeaked in, and Paul, for whatever reason, liked me, and had me do the callbacks, and 2 months later I got offered a job. So it was like, again, even when I'm the one who makes the mistake, I'm still like, well, I'm here, I may as well do it. And it ended up being a great chance and opportunity. And Paul once said to me, because I had 15 years in the company and originated, over 22 roles in works that he created. And by the time I had been there I joined in 93. And so by 99, it was 6 years. I had an injury and I was out for 6 months. And Paul said, maybe you could restage some of my work on his second company, which meant that I had to reconstruct them for 6 dancers instead of maybe 13 dancers or 12 dancers, whichever,
To adapt also the whole.
To adapt, right. And through that, he started sort of having me sit with him to look at work while he was, rehearsing it or whatever when I wasn't dancing. So I feel like I was somewhat guided by Paul to staging his work in it. But yeah, that was the New York company that I needed on my resume.
And that prolonged your career significantly. I mean, made a different encore.
It did.
To stop dancing at 29.
Exactly. And I will tell you, I did stop when I was about 27. And I told you that I had taken up kayaking, and I started working for the North Face, which is an outdoor clothing company. And I worked in administration and I worked in product development. So I was testing water sports active wear. And then I thought about it, and I wanted to go back to school. I wanted to go to college because I didn't have a college degree and I was not earning enough money. And after about 2 years, I got 3 independent phone calls asking if I would audition for these productions. One was a musical, one was an opera, and one was a television program that they needed a substitute to come in for an injury. And I said, oh, well, if I get back into shape, I can earn enough money to finish my degree. So I got myself back into shape. I didn't do the opera. I did do the television show, which turned into a longer term job. And I did almost do the musical, but then it got shut down. It closed before it got into its long run. So I was back in dancing. And it was an interesting challenge because when I went back to dancing, and now I'm 29 years old, I decided I would not put an end date on my dancing. As long as I was feeling capable and able, I would do it. And so it wasn't until I was 46 that I felt like the time was right. And it was my choice. It wasn't because of injury. It wasn't because of those other things. It was my choice. And I was very fortunate to have that. So yeah, I had a 30-year performing career, and 15 of that was with the Paul Taylor Dance Company with Paul Taylor.
That's wonderful. But you're also a businessman, right? Because with the kayak, you created quite a big, you had quite a big adventure. I think it's fascinating. I look at your CV, it doesn't end. First of all, you're like, oh my God, this is a full book. And it's like, you can see you like structure, you like, and you like challenges, and, so would you talk a little bit about that experience? Was it while you were dancing, or was it after?
It was actually while I was dancing that I got started into it. And again, I had 4 major injuries through my 30-year career. And I, again, admit I'm very fortunate. I have a body that heals and comes back. And I hate to say this, but I enjoy the challenge of retraining to come back from injury, because it taught me,
otherwise it doesn't work.
Right. But it also taught me that I needed to constantly look at my training as I got older, because aging for dancing for me was a little bit like being injured. things didn't work. I didn't have as much amplitude. You know, you had to figure out different ways to address it. But I wanted to be able to do my full repertory, which I was fortunate to be able to do while I was 46. So I felt like that was a good time to step down from performing. So one of those injuries where I was out and I wasn't allowed to bear weight on my legs was when I took up kayaking. And I started to do a lot of work with the organization where I learned to kayak, because they did what we call adaptive paddling. And they were working with people with physical disabilities. So I worked and I ended up with very good friends who were deaf or who had multiple sclerosis or had spinal injuries. And because of my training in dancing and teaching and pedagogy, I was used to looking at how people moved physically. So the translation for me of working and teaching outdoor sports, specifically kayaking, was not a far leap. And I enjoyed being outdoors. And I found out that people with physical disabilities, that is the place that they get restricted from being. They can't go outdoors. And so here's an opportunity to work and help others enjoy the outdoors that normally wouldn't. And then in teaching them a new skill, I would be teaching their aides, people that would help people with physical disabilities. So then it was common ground. Then it became like, oh, like my aide has his physical ability, but he can't kayak either, you know, or, you know, she's not as strong as I am because I'm used to using my wheelchair or whatever, you know, or they can feel water with the paddle. You can feel it if you're blind, you know, and so all of a sudden I'm also teaching the aide how to feel the water. It's not just what you see, it's what you feel. And so it became a method of team building, for want of a better description, between people with physical disabilities and their aides. So that became a specialty for me, working with people, working to get people with physical disabilities, kayaking and in the outdoors. And it just turned into this thing where I was so fascinated by how people utilize sports. And I moved to New York. So I did this all the time that I was dancing in California. When I moved to New York, another friend of mine that I'd met through kayaking had just started up a business, his own kayaking business in New York City. And it still exists today, Manhattan Kayak Company. And I joined forces with him. He asked me to help him out. And as you said, I enjoy order and structure and things like that. So I helped him structure his business. I helped, you know, file his papers of incorporation, to restructure the business and to do things and to grow it and to apply for grants and apply for new leases and all of those types of things. And I did that all while I was still dancing. And the advent of the internet, you know, or capacity to do this, that became the method by which I could start a business, run it, manage it while still dancing, you know, and touring around the world.
That's wonderful. So you're not doing that anymore right now.
I ended up once I retired from performing, I was trying to decide whether or not I wanted to do that full time. And as a dancer, what I found was I may have loved doing it as a teenager and enjoyed it and focused on it as something rewarding because it was an activity I liked to do. But when it became a job, I couldn't get away from dancing being a job. Like I was always worried about improving. I was always worried about the execution. I was always worried about the quality of the performance and the integrity of the work. So my relationship to it changed. I got into kayaking because of an injury, and I used to love doing it as a recreation. And I found that as a business, I could no longer enjoy just kayaking and paddling for myself. So I decided I wanted to keep that as a hobby and pursue other interests. I was interested in teaching. I enjoyed teaching. I enjoyed doing that stuff. I was able to utilize my background outside of the United States to stage Paul Taylor's works, and preparation and doing that took up a lot of time. And you know, I've gone back and forth between a freelancer and a full-time job, and I enjoy freelancing. I enjoy that freedom to pick projects, do them, do something else, apply for a grant. You know, I've been a Fulbright recipient for fellowships, which, you know, I was able to go to India. I was able to go to New Zealand with my Fulbrights. I've just rejoined the specialist roster, and I'm looking at projects that may take me hopefully home to Jamaica. So again, you know, freelancing is a wonderful and inconsistent way to live one's life. But if you have the courage, it also brings with it great rewards.
I can't imagine. So, I mean, we're getting to the end of this hour. I don't want to also take too much time, but I have two more questions. The first one is, how did you deal with the last 2 COVID years? You know, how was it for you mentally, emotionally, physically?
So it was difficult, but I'm incredibly blessed that I have a husband that both of us together were able to build a house in the Berkshires. We have our apartment in New York City, but we were able to escape up here and live relatively isolated during that period of time. And through the fact that we have telecommunications and the internet, we have been able to continue to work as we needed. I did not enjoy teaching Zoom classes. I do find that the idea of the need to interact in person was something that got challenged during these last 2 years. But I feel like once we did start to get back, you know, get away from Zoom classes and go into the studio, everyone realized how important human connection is in person, you know, what that necessity is. So, you know, we also brought with us to live, you know, people who were in their advanced ages that are good friends of ours that are also in the dance industry. And I think the last 2 years has built deeper connections to those with whom we had to weather the time away from our normal lives. But I also think that it continues to challenge us in understanding what's important to us in our work, in our daily lives, in what we do, because there is that specter of something that's always, it keeps coming up again. You know, do we have to wear masks? Can we go to the theater? Can we interact? Can we do those types of things?
Like we want our freedom back.
We do, you know, but and it's one kind of restriction, you know, and we have many other restrictions that are not necessarily caused by us, you know, as we see with things like war, as we see with things like poverty and famine and the disparity of incomes. You know, as I said, I grew up in a third world country where when I was growing up, 80% of the population was illiterate. So as a high school student, I got credit for teaching adult literacy, things like that. So it's a very, the world is so varied, and, we get to enjoy certain privileges, and hopefully we don't take them for granted. But I wouldn't say that we want to take away the privileges from everyone. I think we want to be able to embrace providing what opportunities we can as individuals.
Very beautiful and wise. So the last thing I want to ask you is that what would be, if you had one advice to give to a young dancer today, what would that be?
I'm fortunate in that I get to mentor a lot of young dancers through my teaching and through other things that I do. And I would say, as hard as it is, doing what we've just described, not looking as obstacles as sort of a brick wall that you can't get through, but looking at them as a learning capacity for life. Like, nothing's ever going to be perfect in the way that we imagine it. And if it is, we should appreciate it. But at the same time, I would not change the trajectory of my life. As difficult as parts of it have been, the rewards have been equally balancing to what those difficulties are. And the choice to pursue a life in dance is not an easy one. It is, for whatever reasons, that it is time limited. It is the tiniest of percentage of people of whom I feel privileged to still be in the industry, that get to continue it in the industry. But for the million dancers that are out there looking for a job as a dancer, there's probably only 100,000 that can actually get a job continuing as a teacher or regisseur, repetiteur, or, working somewhere else within that industry. But enjoy it, live in the moment, because you have that capacity, and worry less about the future. Because I spent the first 30 years worrying about what I was going to do next. And then I ended up going another 15 and I'm still there.
Okay. So embrace the challenges and the obstacles.
That would be my advice, because they're not going to go away.
All right. Well, Richard, thank you so much. It was really wonderful to have this chat with you. Very colorful and full of life. So it was really fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.